9:30 on the dot. I'll be brief. Thank you everybody for being here. Special thanks to you, Larry, for making the time to be here with us today. I think Larry doesn't need an introduction. He's well known. I might add that he has played a leading role in the public discussion about the advances, challenges, and setbacks of democracy throughout the world. He is professor at Stanford of political science, senior researcher of the Hoover Institution, and he's also founding father of the Journal of Democracy, which is a publication sponsored by the National Endowment for Democracy based in Washington. And we happen to translate the Journal of Democracy to Portuguese here. The foundation does that. And we have published Larry's articles and a variety of articles which deal with the subject of this conversation here today. So without much further ado, let me just, before we start, thank Jamil from Atuação, who has made it possible for this meeting to happen. Actually, Larry is here in Brazil upon invitation by Atuação, and they do wonderful publications. They're selling books on my back. I strongly advise you to buy their books. We have no commission on the books, so I'm not inducing you to buy books. I'm just saying they're very good books. So now it's time to turn the floor to you, Larry. I think 30 minutes would be okay. Then we can start a Q&A here in a very informal atmosphere. Thank you very much again.
Sergio, thank you. It's my great honor to be here at this foundation. I would like to say publicly, or at least in the semi-public setting of this roundtable.
We're being recorded. So.
Well, that's so even better. I'd like what I'm about to say to be as public as humanly possible. I am really honored to be here at this foundation, which it commemorates the work and the legacy of Fernando Henrique Cardoso. I have a tremendous amount of admiration for him personally and what he accomplished, first of all, to stabilize the currency and the economy, and then to stabilize democracy and to show that individual leadership can make a very important difference to the success of democracy, can restore confidence in democracy, and can move social policy forward to greater justice and inclusion, which is very important, as I will restate later, to the future of democracy. I think we're at a moment, I will explain, where you may feel this in Brazil. I think you do, but we feel it in the United States too. I think we've seen it recently on display and will be for many years in France and elsewhere in Europe and around the world, that democracy is being tested, democracy is being challenged, democracy has been going through a difficult period globally, and this in some ways will accentuate in the years to come. I think we need to revive our institutions and renew our normative faith in democracy as a system of government, but that cannot happen without good, honest, devoted, effective, and relatively selfless democratic leadership. And I think that's what President Cardoso gave to Brazil, and it's the model that he has presented to a lot of evolving democracies around the world. So with that preface, I would like to talk about what's happened to democracy in the world since the third wave of global democratic expansion began in 1974. I'm not going to dwell a lot on these slides. I'll begin just briefly by saying what is elaborated in one of the essays in the volume that I've contributed to in this collection, which is an essay on democratic quality that I've offered with the Italian political scientist Leonardo Morlino, that our goal should not simply be to develop and sustain democracy, but rather a good democracy that is worth sustaining and that can win the enduring faith and loyalty of the public. And I think a quality democracy is a liberal democracy which somehow blends and balances three elements: the element of popular sovereignty or majority rule, the element of liberal government, which protects freedom in general and minority rights in particular, and affirms the civic culture of moderation, civility, and tolerance, and the element which Guillermo O'Donnell, the late Argentine political scientist who spent some time in this country, refers to as Republican government in terms of the ideal of good governance with the rule of law and horizontal accountability that entails many different agencies of government that include not only the judiciary, but the counter-corruption apparatus, electoral administration, economic regulatory agencies, auditing institutions that ensure that government is transparent, honest, effective, and that executive power does not violate the principles of good government and the rule of law. These things can be in tension with one another. We can talk about that in the discussion if you want to, but a quality government must try and achieve these different dimensions of democratic quality and these three different themes to some extent simultaneously. This then brings me to introduce a distinction between electoral democracy, which is a minimal level in which people can choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections, and liberal democracy, which is a higher threshold in which these different dimensions I articulated to you exist in greater depth. I basically measure the liberal dimension with reference to the Freedom House ratings of political rights and civil liberties. So the blue line is a subset of the red line, electoral democracy, and simply indicates in every year the percentage of states that have a 1 or a 2 on the Freedom House scale, the 7-point scale of both political rights and civil liberties. And you can note from this slide two things that I think are important. One is that the percentage of states that are either, I'm not sure this pointer is really going to work well, the percentage of states that are either electoral democracies on the red line or liberal democracies, the subset on the blue line, peaked at 2006. And since then, there's been oscillation or slight decline, but certainly no improvement. That, in its simplest form, is the democratic recession of the past 10, now 11 years. If you take into account that democracy is much more likely in countries under 1 million population than over 1 million population, then you can make an adjustment and see that if you're looking at the larger countries, the figure is not so optimistic, neither for that nor for liberal democracy. And then you can get to this slide, which I think actually we should pay more attention to, that looking at only the states with populations over 1 million population, again, we peaked at 2006 in the world. The percentage of democracies has declined to a little over 50%. And the percentage of liberal democracies has subsided in these last 11 years to about 32%. And if you allow for the fact, well, I'll get to it in a minute, that some of these democracies are themselves dubious, to try to be restrained and non-judgmental and non-ideological, I have left in the category of electoral democracy states like Bolivia and Ecuador, about which I have significant doubts. I've moved out some states that I think, like Bangladesh, can't qualify as democracies anymore. I've left in Guatemala. Can we say that there's really popular sovereignty in Guatemala today? Maybe, but after a certain point, even in a liberal democracy, becomes so illiberal in terms of the protection for citizen rights, in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of the protection of citizens from arbitrary violence, that you have to ask, is even the political right to choose one's leaders in a free and fair election degraded beyond a reasonable point at that point? Speaking regionally, then, we can just say that by a very maybe generous estimate, 85% of the states in Latin America and the Caribbean are at least electoral democracies, and about half are liberal democracies. But disproportionately, these are Caribbean island states. And if you just look at the countries of Central and South America, over 1 million population, the figure is a little less promising. It would not include, for example, Peru, certainly not Paraguay, not even Colombia, and of course Venezuela is no longer even a democracy. These are the trends in freedom by region. I'm sorry, this looks like a very badly designed subway system. But this orange line here shows the trend in levels of freedom in Latin America as measured by Freedom House, on average, averaging political rights and civil liberties from 1 which is most free to 7 which is least free, across both civil liberties and political rights from 1974 to the end of last year. And keep in mind, as the number goes lower, it gets better. That's the way Freedom House scale works. So that, again, you can see a slight erosion beginning around 2006. And it's what happens in most, not all, regions. Of the countries outside the advanced industrial democracies of Europe and North America primarily, Latin America has the best regional average levels of freedom, except for Central and Eastern Europe. But, can it improve? It certainly can. And it was even a little better 10 years ago. These are the same global trends in freedom.
Stands for what?
Middle East and North Africa. So we have Latin America and the Caribbean, Central and Eastern Europe, the Asia-Pacific region, the Middle East and North Africa, which is, as you can see, remains the least liberal region of the world, the most repressive, and reflects the, hope for the Arab Spring and then the decline when it failed. And then there's the former Soviet Union. And the green line is sub-Saharan Africa, which has improved a lot from the pre-Cold War, or the period of the Cold War, improved. And then you can see actually the greatest erosion in freedom has been in sub-Saharan Africa. And that should not be surprising. These are the empirical reasons why one can say that there's been, for about a decade now, a democratic recession. The first is that the percentage of states that are democracies peaked around 2005 at about 62% of all states, maybe a little bit less, about 50%, 54% of states over 1 million population. And that was the end of democratic progress in the world. We've had some new democracies. We've had more retreats from democracy than gains. And I repeat that many of the countries that are classified by Freedom House as democracies are pretty dubious highly illiberal, and in the case of Kenya, for example, involved elections that I think have been not even close to being free and fair. The second element of the democratic recession is that for each of the last 11 years, more countries have been declining in freedom than have been gaining. That's these years here. Again, 2006 is a break point. In the period of the immediate post-Cold War from 1991 to 2005, in most of these years, 1.5, 2.5 times, 3 times as many countries were improving in their freedom score as were declining. And then you see the just reversal of the trend. And then you got 3/4 as many, half as many countries gaining as the ones that were declining. It's just a mirror image of freedom in at least partial, mild, but sustained retreat. This retreat has been most noticeable in the breakdown of democracy in some very big and consequential states, like the ones you see on this screen. And the majority of breakdowns of democracy that have happened in the world in the 42 years of the third wave have happened since 2000. As a result, if you just divide the third wave of democracy into 4 decades, 10 or 11 years, you see this pattern. In the first decade, 17% of all the states that were democracies, all the democratic regimes, broke down. It makes sense. The third wave was just getting started. Many of these attempts were very tentative. Global norms weren't congealed yet in favor of democracy. In the next 2 decades, the democratic failure rate declined to less than 10% in each decade. And now something for us to worry about. In the last decade, it's up to nearly what it was in the first decade, 16%. And if you add up all the democratic regimes that have existed in some countries like the Philippines and Thailand 2 or 3 times, the failure rate has been nearly 32%. And if you subtract the advanced industrial democracies and ask about the others, the failure rate is up to about 38 or 39%. I now show you several slides that decompose the Freedom House scales of political rights and civil liberties from 2 scales into 3. I've taken out the measures of transparency, judicial independence, control of corruption, and created a 3rd scale, which is the green line at the bottom, transparency and the rule of law, to show what I anticipated would be the case, and is in fact the case in region after region, that during this period of the democratic recession, we have seen measures of transparency, good governance, control of corruption, and rule of law trailing measures of political rights and civil liberties, and being the leading indicator of democratic deterioration. And though the levels vary from region to region on a scale of 0 to 1, the trend is the same everywhere. That is, that the green line of transparency and the rule of law is the worst performer, and has tended to decline more than some of the others. This is the former Soviet states. This is the Middle East and North Africa, and this is Latin America. Now, the level has not really changed over 11 years, now 12, in Latin America and the Caribbean, but you can see the gap between political rights and civil liberties on the one hand and rule of law on the other has remained quite substantial. I have argued through a number of writings that this is the problem that most needs attention, and that when people lose faith in democracy, it's most often because of corruption, bad governance, weak rule of law, lack of human security, and lack of transparency. So I hope you'll bear that in mind. I summarize here some of the trends regionally in terms of Latin America, where over the last 12 years, between 2005 and 2016, 8 countries have, at the end of last year, a worse freedom score than they had in 2005, while only 5 have a better one. And several countries that were at one point democracies have slipped backward. I'm going to skip the Arab region, and in the interest of time, try and make 3 final points, 2 of which are on the slides, and 1 of which I keep forgetting to mention, and people keep forgetting to ask me, so I want to speak to. The first is the additional point that needs to be made about why we are in some ways a more serious challenge, a more serious situation than the data reveal, or than that I think we were in just a few years ago. There has been a resilience and resurgence of authoritarianism. Of course, the Arab Spring failed. The revolution failed in Egypt. And you now have a dictator in Egypt, General al-Sisi there in the middle, who is far more repressive, frankly, than Hosni Mubarak was at any point in his 29 years of not at all democratic rule. You, of course, have Vladimir Putin, who's one of the richest men in the world, at the top on the left, and Xi Jinping on the right. The critical point to make here is that China and Russia, and to some extent other authoritarian regimes in Iran and elsewhere in the world, have been developing a new energy and a new level of offensiveness and resourcefulness and connectedness at promoting authoritarian values, tools, and techniques. They are reacting out of fear that the color revolutions will reach beyond their borders to their entrenched authoritarian regimes, that they will be delegitimized by the spread of democratic values and information. And so they are not only censoring the internet from their own population with increasingly comprehensive technological investments, but they are projecting soft power in a way a decade or 2 ago that it was mainly democracies were doing to promote their authoritarian values and to try and sow confusion, cynicism, and despair into the democracies of the world. Of course, the paradigmatic manifestation of this was the Russian cyber assault on electoral democracy in the United States in 2016, without which I think Hillary Clinton would have been elected president of the United States. I'll be glad to explain why in further detail. Of course, this is only the beginning of what will be an increasingly sophisticated Russian governmental assault on democracy and truth around the world. They tried this in the French election. They have tried it in other democracies. They've already assaulted democratic flows of information in the Baltic states and indeed internet freedom in those areas. And they're only just getting started. The Russians have invested an extraordinary level of resources in reporting of false information and mixing truthful information with false information in very sophisticated and seamless ways, both on television through RT and Sputnik and on the internet. So it's impossible to really distinguish between them. I really recommend to you here a book by Peter Pomerantsev, the Russian-European journalist, called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which is an account of his time in Russia dealing with the information space, and he's now an expert on this based in London. And the book that we published at the Journal of Democracy last year called Authoritarianism Goes Global, which is an effort to document what these authoritarian regimes are doing. Anyway, they have upped their game. There's a new level of sophistication and resourcefulness here, and assault on truth and assault on norms that I think has not even begun to bring and to inspire the necessary response from democracies around the world to identify and isolate and stigmatize false information and to push back in the projection of democratic values and norms. The second thing that's going on, which I refer to here, is the trouble with democracies in the European Union and in the United States in response to several challenges that need to be noted. Number one, the challenge of economic globalization, of increasing integration, and the way I think it has in many ways enhanced overall wealth in the world, but not in any kind of equitable way, and at the cost of huge dislocations in terms of job loss. I need to stress the second point, that there is a more powerful accelerator of economic dislocation and job loss, which we are seeing unfold now, beginning to have ferocious speed and power in the United States and Europe, but which is coming everywhere to globalized and reasonably developed countries, including this one. And this is the revolution in robotics, artificial intelligence, and automation in general, which is going to displace a staggering proportion of the manual labor jobs in the world. And we really have not begun to think through, as democratic societies, how to manage this and how to refashion the linkage between work and reward, between work and income, in ways that can retain and revalidate human dignity and human worth. I realize it's a very grand statement, but next to global warming, there's no problem I worry about in the world more than this one. And then, of course, related to the first one of globalization in the economic sense is globalization in the human or social sense of increasing flows of people across national boundaries. The single biggest reason I think why Brexit passed in Britain is not because of the European Union itself, but because of a reaction against the Schengen borderless migration within Europe and the flows of immigrants into Britain in a way that was leading many British citizens to feel like they were losing their culture, losing what they had come to value in their society. I think in the United States, you are a country largely of immigrants. Brazil can understand this better than most countries, that we are elevated by immigration and we are elevated by diversity. But most countries are not Brazil and the United States. They are not mainly composed of immigrants, and many of them are having a hard time adapting to this. And even the United States, as a nation of immigrants, has been or was manipulated last year into being alarmed by the pace of immigration and lured by the appeal of right-wing authoritarian populism. Let me summarize the reasons why. I have to skip a few things in order to do it. I think democracy and freedom have been in a mild but perhaps accelerating democratic recession, and make the answer to the point about why 2005. I think the most general point I can make is that when democracy recedes, you will almost always see some manifestation of this first factor and often the second. No liberal democracy has ever suddenly died. It's just never happened. If you can cite an instance for me, I will be glad to correct my statement. A way of stating this precisely is if you look at the Freedom House scale of political rights and civil liberties, we have no instance in the last 42 years in which a country had a 1 or a 2 on political rights and a 1 or a 2 on civil liberties and experienced a sudden death. In those relatively unusual circumstances where liberal democracies eventually died, it was because they first experienced a period of deterioration from their liberal character. And so always we see involved rising corruption, lack of transparency, abuse of power, and then maybe other things too, executive abuse of the Constitution and the rule of law in a very intentional way, rising violence, criminality, maybe more momentum and autonomy for organized crime. This is a cluster of factors that just figures prominently in the expiration of democracy. Frequently, we see as well severe and rising polarization along ethnic lines, religious lines, or some kind of social identity lines, or maybe economic class polarization. That was a story more of the second wave of democratic breakdowns, but maybe it will become again as the first two drivers I talked about of automation and economic globalization intensify economic inequality around the world. We face problems globally now, the democracies of weak and declining political institutions. You know the prominent symptom of this, which is declining levels of public trust and confidence in parties and in national parliaments, which is not only down to around 10 or 15% in Brazil, but at similarly low levels in many other established democracies. And of course, over time, bad economic performance, particularly when you combine low or no economic growth with rising levels of inequality, is a powerful formula for delegitimation. I want to close by answering a question that I thought would be asked in my last 3 presentations and wasn't, because it's been asked very frequently when I've given this lecture. Why 2005? Why 2006? Why do we see on every slide this inflection point? And I have a few answers to this. One is that we were beginning to see economic decline and crisis in a number of countries. And of course, this crystallized with the financial crisis that gripped the U.S. and then globally beginning in September of 2008. That created certainly an unfavorable climate. I think an important factor was played by the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the disaster that was, which I saw firsthand briefly on the ground there in an ill-fated assignment that we can talk about some other time. And what this did was diminish public support for democracy promotion, both in the United States and in Europe, particularly the United Kingdom, but also continental Europe, and just removed a lot of public financial and political support for the idea of promoting democratic institutions and values because of the highly regrettable way in which the George W. Bush administration tried to justify the intervention in Iraq as an exercise in democracy promotion when it was discovered that there were no weapons of mass destruction. But I also need to close with this point, which maybe will put everything I've said in perspective. The third wave of global democratization was unprecedented in human history because it saw the expansion of democracy, democratic expectations, values, and institutions on an unprecedented scope that had been unimaginable even in the mid-1980s, just a few years before the end of the Soviet bloc. And democracy spread in the late 80s and 1990s to an improbably large proportion of states in the world, including many states in the world that were lacking virtually all of the presumed prerequisites for democracy: economic development, a middle class, effective state institutions, some degree of a rule of law, some national unity or social homogeneity, and so on. I could go on. Some prior experience with democracy. As a social scientist, I will just make the retrospective observation, which I hope we can bear in mind as a long-term perspective. It was inevitable there was going to be some kind of market correction. Not all of these democracies were going to be sustainable. But that doesn't mean we should be apathetic in the face of it. And that certainly doesn't mean that the decline and strangulation of democracy and the squandering of promising attempts at democracy in middle and upper middle income countries like Venezuela and Thailand and then Turkey was at all inevitable. And I think a lesson that must be learned from these experiences, because it's a lesson that cuts across these three countries and a number of others, is number one, don't take anything for granted. I really, truly believed it's the single most embarrassing sentence that I wrote in the spirit of democracy. I truly believed in the early 2000s that Thailand would never experience another military coup. And I had been there many times. I think I actually knew something about Thailand. It was not idle speculation, and many Thais believed that as well. I was hopeful about Turkey. Even in the early years, I was skeptical of my liberal friends who were saying the minute Erdogan came to power, this man is not a Democrat. He's a religious ideologue and a power-hungry man. We're deeply worried about what's going to happen to the free press and so on. And I never for a moment had any illusions about Hugo Chavez. So we shouldn't assume that just because democracy is in place for a while, just because there's been a prior history of democratic failure and the country has learned from it, presumably, just because there's been a certain level of economic development and education that a country has acquired, that democracy is now consolidated or immune. And I will tell you, there are many, which may really provoke discussion, there are many social scientists in the United States, many scholars of democracy in the United States who have, in this respect, the advantage of having studied democratic experiences in other parts of the world, who are not taking anything for granted in the United States right now, and who have formed various projects and consortia, including something we call Bright Line Watch, which will hold a conference at Yale in October, to identify markers and indicators of democratic deterioration potentially in the United States that need to be flagged and, if I can use the word in conclusion, resisted. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Before we start, while I was listening to your presentation, it came to my mind a nice phrase by ex-finance minister and Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who said some time ago that in establishing the rule of law, the five first the first 5 centuries are the hardest. So I think we're still in that period. So, who wants to make a question? Please identify yourself very briefly and pose a concise
Thank you. My name is Arturo Yaram. I am the Peruvian consul. You mentioned at the beginning that Peru is not a democracy, which surprised me.
I can't imagine that.
Well,
it's cannot be classified as a liberal democracy. Yes.
Well, because I wanted to say that since 1980 we have general elections, including during Fujimori's dictatorship. And of course we are learning from that. As a matter of fact, we are stressing transparency, accountability, etc. That's one thing. The other one is the importance of cultural and political history. That's, again, in the Peruvian case, Montesinos, you know very well who he is, was the main teacher of transparency and democracy in Peru with his Vladimirios. He was the moral leader during the post-Fujimori's regime, and we learned the importance of free press and, of course, the importance of accountability of all our institutions. Thank you.
Before we move on, would you like to clarify your point on why don't you think Peru is a liberal democracy?
Well, let me say 2 things. Number one, in classifying countries as liberal democracies or not, I'm simply going by the Freedom House data on political rights and civil liberties. And I think for some time now, Peru, like most Andean countries, has had a 3 on civil liberties, which include measures of transparency and so on, and a 2 on political rights. I'll go back and check. So I'm just going by the Freedom House data. If you have a dispute, you should take it up with Freedom House. I will say, I think their characterization is accurate or reasonable. In many respects, I think what Peru has achieved in democracy is noteworthy and certainly very much needs to be defended. But I am very worried about your country because twice now, someone who I think would probably have released Vladimir Montesinos from prison, as well as her father, almost became president of your country. You know, I have the freedom of not being a diplomat, and so I can say whatever I think and believe. And what I think and believe is that what I thought and believed about Hugo Chavez, what my friends in Turkey thought and believed about Erdogan, what I thought and believed on the basis of ample evidence, which is now being borne out in the Philippines under the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte, and that is, I don't think Keiko Fujimori is a Democrat. I don't think she is deeply committed to democracy. I think that somebody who's interested in investigative journalism should do a serious analysis of where all her campaign money has come from, and whether she can demonstrate that it isn't drawing upon the 1, 2, I don't know how many billions of dollars her father stole from the country. And I don't think Democrats should be apathetic about these things. The fact that twice somebody like this has been able to become so close to being the president of the country and is now, if I can try and be a little bit polite, exerting some significant leverage by her majority in the Congress over the course of the current presidential administration under the leadership of someone I do respect and I do think is a sincere Democrat, is a very serious matter. I think democracy in a lot of places is hanging from a very slender thread. Let me tell you, my friends in the Philippines during the 6 years under Noe Aquino's presidency, which just really recently ended, left rather optimistic that President Aquino, like his mother, had put the country on a better track, governed with a remarkable restraint in terms of corruption, put in a lot of people who were technocratic leaders who addressed a lot of the social problems in the country. And then you get this thug, this murderous thug who has been elected president of the country, has presided over the extrajudicial execution of over 7,000 people. And now I think democracy in the Philippines is under life support. I think a lesson of many of these instances of democratic failure at the hands of elected presidents is that we need to be much more vigilant in scrutinizing who is running for the leadership of a country and what their leadership could represent for the future of democracy. I'm sorry to be so candid, but if we can't do it in this kind of setting, I don't know where we can.
Good. Well, first Flavio, then Norman Gall, then you.
Maybe take them in
All right. Yeah.
succession, so
Yeah, good
my
idea.
answer will be more concise.
All right.
My name is Flavio Bittelman. I'm the consul of Moldova in Brazil. And I just want to clarify, you made a presentation about the countries with less than 1 million people. We don't have too many countries less than 1 million people, so we couldn't really understand. And the second point, you promised...
40 of them in the world.
Yeah. And the second point, you promised to clarify about Hillary Clinton, how she could win.
Okay, Norman.
First of all, I mean, I don't think that democracy is doing so badly. It's doing badly in Brazil. It's doing badly, obviously, in Venezuela. I lived for 6 years in Venezuela. There are two problems. I'd like you to try and discuss this. First of all, I mean, there's a great difference between between the Pacific coast countries of Latin America and the Atlantic coast countries of Latin America. The Chile, Peru, even Bolivia and Colombia have evolved politically. They have maintained stable governments. There has been great social progress in these countries. In the Atlantic coast countries, Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina have really have not made much progress in the consolidation of democracy. I mean, I'd like your view as to how leadership develops. There is a striking absence of leadership in Brazil. There is a deep political crisis, and flagrant and endemic corruption, which is eroding political legitimacy. Unlike in European countries, and there is no new leadership arising, and there are no new political formulations or ideas being generated. I was just wondering, I know that you're new to Brazil, but from your international experience, I was wondering how you could address these issues.
Henny Cook here. I'm a political scientist. There's been a wave of outsiders and newcomers into politics, sometimes in the form of political parties or in other times as politicians. And one can claim that these newcomers can represent new ideas or fresh ideas, and that would be good for democracy. But one common characteristic of all of them is that they deny politics. They say that they are outsiders, and in the end, do you see these newcomers or outsiders into politics as a force, a good force into democracy, or they will have a negative impact and advance the problems you just described?
First to the Moldovan consul, thank you for your questions. I was surprised too. There are fewer countries with less than 1 million population than there used to be, because populations grow and some of them are now above 1 million. But there's still over 40 countries in the world. So if you go from all countries in the world, about 195, to countries with less than 1 million population, you go from about 195 countries to 150 something. So that's not a trivial number of countries. I think the reason why I think it's useful to take them out is, you look at these, the Bahamas, Barbados, these Caribbean island states, Vanuatu, some of these are not only less than a million people, they're less than 100,000 people. Are we going to learn much from, I don't mean to pick on it, Liechtenstein? But there are a number of them, and I think there's some logical reasons why they're more often democracies and liberal democracies. You have face-to-face ties, it promotes trust. Societies are less complex. In some of these island states, there is a long British rule of law tradition. We could go on about that, but it's not a trivial number. I argue with a lot of people. There's not consensus about this in the United States, but I personally have very little doubt that if Russia had not intervened at all in the U.S. election, and even with the FBI intervention, Hillary Clinton would have won, and I don't think it even would have been so close. There was, without passing premature judgment on what I think requires intense and relentless investigation, which is now going to be a little bit harder than it would have been 2 days ago, there was evident coordination, or the appearance of coordination between promoters of Donald Trump's candidacy on social media and Russian hacking and release of stolen, we need to use that word, information from the Clinton campaign through the willing cooperation and medium of WikiLeaks. And you can see how this double assault, the Russian theft and release of this stolen information, and then the social media drumming up of cynicism about Hillary Clinton, and then the inflation and intensification of this cynicism through organized efforts in social media, many of them not even by human beings, but by what are called bots, automated interventions in social media platforms like Twitter, and others by what we call trolls, in this case, paid interveners in social media dialogues that were coming from certain places in Russia, some of which American intelligence has identified as the headquarters of a major Russian military social media operation, hacking and trolling operation. This was all being coordinated, and there would be a leak, and then there'd be an explosion of cynical outrage, and then it would be multiplied many times over, and the alt-right and the Russian intervention seemed to be working in a kind of concert, okay? I think that is part of what the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other American intelligence agencies are now trying to investigate, assess, document, whatever. Was it done with the positive coordination of leaders of Donald Trump's presidential campaign? I don't know. Was it done with the knowledge of the presidential candidate? I don't know. I don't think it's obvious that it wasn't, but I wouldn't make the allegation that it was without evidence. I only know the circumstantial information that this relentless drumbeat of look what she said in this, look at what the campaign did about this, look at what they did to Bernie Sanders, and so on, was highly coordinated and powerfully inflated by the Russian social media war against the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton, and by extension, American democracy. If 77,000 votes we're talking about in a country where roughly 100 million votes were cast, if 77,000 votes had changed from one side to the other in 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, or if 150,000 people, roughly, who became so disillusioned that instead of voting for Hillary Clinton, they just didn't come out to vote in those 3 states on November 8th. If either of those things had been different, Hillary Clinton would not only have won the popular vote, she would have won the Electoral College in the United States as well. It's just hard for me to imagine that this scale of intense, relentless cynicism driving intervention did not change more than 150,000 votes in 3 states. Now, to Norman's intervention, I would say 2 things. I think there are distinctions in Latin America. Countries are moving in different trajectories and different directions. I would put it a little differently. I've already implied difference. I think Chile and Uruguay, I'd say, are consolidated liberal democracies. I personally think, I love Peru. I've been to your country. It's an amazing and beautiful country. I would not describe it as either a consolidated or a liberal democracy, but I think it's made a lot of democratic progress, and I wish it well. I don't know to what extent it is correct to classify both Bolivia and Ecuador as democracies today. I know people I respect who raise questions. That they've made social progress, I don't doubt, and leveled inequalities and generated greater social inclusion, I don't doubt. And I think those are important accomplishments. And I think Colombia has made some very significant progress as well, including hopefully a lasting end to the internal conflict. I am somewhat hopeful about Argentina. Maybe I'm naive. I realize Argentina is always the country that people are hopeful about, along with Brazil. But I think they've got a new opportunity there under an interesting president who falls into the category of outsiders. So let me conclude with these questions about insiders, outsiders, and leadership. I don't want to make a political comment about the current crisis in Brazil that could be construed as at all partisan. It's not my place, and I wouldn't have the knowledge to sustain it anyway. I will only say that I don't think democracy will gain in Brazil by any force in the media, the courts, politics, or civil society holding back from pursuit of the truth about the nature and extent of corruption in politics and about whatever acts were done or not done, out of fear that cynicism with politics will thereby be intensified. I think if democracy is going to move forward and the pattern of politics in a country like this is going to move onto a better path, there needs to be accountability, there needs to be documentation, and there needs to obviously be a systemic change and uplifting of the judicial system and the rules of the political game. I only hope that civil society, political and social analysts, social media commentators, and others in Brazil will mediate the crisis and mediate whatever judicial findings and decisions are passed down, and frame the situation in such a way that the emphasis is put on institutional reform and renovation rather than cynicism. And I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples. It's pretty obvious that Brazil has a really major problem with party and campaign finance. I can refer you to International Idea and the book they did on party and campaign finance, and suggest a lot of interesting alternatives that might be looked at for party and campaign finance. I can suggest that one thing we've learned about party and campaign finance is that the worst poison is opaqueness and a lack of transparency, and that the rules requiring instant reporting of all political party donations, should be really rigorously enforced. But, one thing I've learned from this subject, and I say this without even knowing what the laws say in Brazil, is that if you don't set realistic limits on what parties can raise from private sources, then this has been true in Korea, it's been true in a different way in the US and elsewhere, you're almost ensuring that everybody's going to skirt the law in some way. With respect to the question about leadership and the wave of outsiders or newcomers, which I realize may also have Brazil in mind in part, I think democracies are clearly going through a difficult time because we see so many outsiders and newcomers being elected. Ideally, one would want to have political leadership exercised by experienced people who know how to get things done. When there is an era of cynicism and institutional malfunctioning, it is natural for electorates to look for outsiders who aren't tainted by the functioning of the system. And, sometimes they don't do too badly. I am certainly not without very significant criticism of Barack Obama, but I think he was a reasonably successful president by the standards of recent decades. He certainly is one of the few who left office with a reasonably high public approval rating. He saved the American economy and the world economy from a Great Depression. He restored economic growth in the United States after the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. He passed the first comprehensive health care bill in half a century. And he did something to reposition the United States on climate change. Not enough, in my view, but something. I mean, that if that's all there was, and it isn't all there was, it's not a bad record for 8 years. And so lack of experience is not intrinsically desirable, but it may be preferable to the alternatives in certain political situations. And I think there may be political moments, and here the easiest thing for me to do is to refer to the current unfolding reality in France, where the best you can hope for is someone who paints himself as an outsider and a newcomer, but who has enough experience to have some understanding how government works and enough political intuition to know that he can't govern without a political party. I think it's extremely significant that Emmanuel Macron has not just started a political movement, but is starting a political party and is recruiting candidates to run on it and is beginning to attract some significant figures. And so the test I would pose is not whether someone is an outsider or an insider, a newcomer or an old-timer, not even what messages are they giving. If someone wants to kind of ride the wave of cynicism about the established politicians by exploiting their relative image of freshness, I'm okay with that if they're then ready to and knowledgeable enough to govern responsibly and with respect for political needs and political expertise. And so that's what I would look for. Sometimes a political moment just doesn't allow for the luxury of turning to political experience. And the best you can hope for is someone who can claim to be an outsider, but has enough responsibility, at least a little bit of political experience, and enough integrity and good sense to be an effective leader.
I think we still have time for another round. But before we go on, let me just take advantage of the fact that you've mentioned the book, The Cost of Democracy, which is a book published by IDEA. And May 30, we will be holding a seminar with one of the co-authors of the book, great. Daniel Sovato. So you're all invited. André, you please make sure that they all get the invitation. So then, ladies first, Maria Hermínia, then Luiz Felipe.
Thank you, Maria Hermínia Tavares, political science from University of São Paulo. Thank you very much for a very exciting presentation. I have two questions. The first is about why. And when you mentioned the possible causes of the decline, you mentioned economic decline, U.S. invasion of Iraq and the erosion of the idea of promoting democracy, and the setbacks of the third wave. And how about China? In these circumstances, the rise of China and successful rise of China, did it play any role in this issue, in this process? And the second one is about your table when you disaggregate the data from Freedom House in 3 dimensions. I think that what strikes us is not the decline, but the consistent and stable distance between the electoral democracy and the second one I can remember, and the rule of law in the third wave democracies. I think this is the most striking data. Nothing changed in 20 years of democratization and democratic experience to diminish the gap between electoral democracy and the rule of law. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Luis Felipe from the Center of Public Leadership. I have two brief questions. The first, I'd like to get the case of Turkey that you have mentioned briefly. How institutions can react to outsiders that try to topple democracy. So I think this is an important question because the phenomena in Turkey could happen in other very liberal, stable democracies like Belgium or Holland. It did not happen, but it could have happened if we had a wave of that. So, and how institutions can react to that, and so in a way how they can again restore democracy. And the second thing, it's a question very important about values. If the value of civility and civilization starts to fade away, this polarization will grow so fast that can be extremely dangerous for democracy. So is it possible to have a democracy without the sense of civility and civilization?
I am Beatriz Cardoso, director of the foundation here and director of an NGO in education called Laboratory of Education. So you said that we shouldn't take for granted that even countries with a good level of education and civil rights acquired, they will be protected from protecting their democracy. So my question is, where should we look in terms of where should we invest to create and maintain democracy? Of course, I work with education. I'm thinking about education, but I think it's not only. So what would you recommend? Because otherwise can be very disappointing to think about if even those countries are not safe.
Okay, just two very brief ones. One is about the differences between China and Russia. And as let's assume that they are threats to democracy, but they play different games. One might say that China plays the game of a responsible stakeholder in world affairs. When you compare it to Russia, this is the first question. The second question is that you mentioned at some point in your presentation that there are people in the United States that have created marks to anticipate possible breaks in the rule of law promoted by the not-so-new administration. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? What are the marks? And in your view, what are the biggest dangers to democracy in this sort of stress test that the U.S. is undergoing?
Okay. Well, let me start with China, Russia, and the United States then. Yes, I definitely agree that China and Russia are behaving in quite different ways on the world stage, and that Russia has been far more dangerous, far more destabilizing, and far more subversive of democracy in its neighborhood, which, sir, is your neighborhood, as we know and worry about, and now well beyond it. China has stolen a lot of industrial secrets from the United States, and we have reason to think has penetrated the email systems of some prominent universities and research institutes in the United States, but China has not sought to subvert the democratic process in the United States. China has not launched a cyber assault on American democracy. I think the evidence is now, overwhelming and beyond the dispute of anyone except the Russian government and those who don't want to look very objectively at the evidence that Russia has done this, that it was a deliberate effort of the Russian state, that Russian military intelligence, GRU, and its internet hacking and invasion organizations, one of which is called, in the slang, Fancy Bear, that they have been systematically involved in this activity, and that they appear to be trying to learn from their efforts to improve them. So I actually don't have the level of alarm about China's behavior on the world stage that I do have with respect to Russia. Moreover, this is now a very, significant diversion from the topic of our gathering, but I will simply say, since we have, I think, a sophisticated and broadly internationally engaged audience here, that the most urgent international or foreign policy or national security problem facing the United States now is the North Korean nuclear program. There are a lot of Americans, I happen to be one of them, who think that we simply cannot allow North Korea to develop an intercontinental ballistic missile that is capable of launching a nuclear warhead that would obliterate Washington, D.C., period. And that the program has to be stopped soon, one way or another. And I think China is beginning to play a very significant and constructive role. And it is telling that President Trump has very rapidly backtracked on all of his economic nationalism about China, because he sees how urgent the problem is, how important China is to a resolution of the problem, and even sees that, the only way this is not going to end catastrophically is through negotiations, which is why he made a rather clumsy attempt, in my view, but in any way, one that's noteworthy to signal that he is ready to engage in diplomacy with the North Korean regime.
And that the president of North Korea is a pretty smart cookie.
Yeah. Well, if I were to list, even now, at the 4-month marker or less of his presidency, all of the admiring things that Donald Trump has said about dictators and autocrats in the world, we'd be here until early tomorrow morning. Now, so you said China is a responsible stakeholder in world affairs. I would say, yeah. It has been reasonably so, particularly for an authoritarian regime. And this is something we can and should build on. I don't think it should lead us to ignore and be silent about China's human rights violations. I don't think it should lead American universities and private institutions to submit to the bullying and intimidation of the Beijing government when they invite the Dalai Lama to come and give a speech at their institution and then are threatened with all sorts of terrible consequences if they go through with it. But, as you said, everything is relative, and China's cooperation is hugely important to the future of the world. Let me now answer the question that you raised about China and explain why I did not put China on the chart. I follow the public opinion data from developing and emerging market regions of the world very closely. And I see no evidence so far that China's rise and economic success has inspired at the level of mass public opinion any desire to emulate the political system of China. China's most aggressive, energetic is maybe a better word, or resourceful, intrusion into another region in the last decade has been in sub-Saharan Africa, although I realize it's becoming a more and more significant investor and presence in Latin America as well. And I think the data from the Afrobarometer are quite striking here. People are fascinated by the China model. They would really like the economic growth rate of China, but they have no interest in the political system of China. And levels of popular support for democracy and freedom and the rule of law have subsided, yes, a little bit in the last 6, 7 years in Africa, but only a little bit. What is significant is that the rulers of Africa, and particularly of semi-democratic or authoritarian regimes, Yoweri Museveni in Uganda is a classic example. Kagame in Rwanda, the Ethiopians, and so on. They are laboring very hard to justify the intensification of authoritarian rule in their countries as an embodiment of, a pursuit of, the China model. And it's not out of a sincere admiration for the China model, in my view. It is out of a grasping attempt to find some way to legitimate their authoritarian project. And Rwanda is a special case that would require more discussion. But in most of Africa, the people just aren't buying it. Authoritarian rule is under severe pressure in Ethiopia. People are absolutely disgusted with 30 years of increasingly corrupt rule in Uganda. And I could just go on and on. I believe, this is why I really don't count Kenya as a democracy, that President Uhuru Kenyatta was only returned to office in the last election through really pretty serious electoral fraud and so on. So I don't forget it, Sergio, you asked what are the markers of the Bright Line Watch project. I don't know. The project's still in its early days, but I can tell you, it's kind of obvious. What would you look for? It helps to have a little Latin American experience here, right? And experience kind of a global nature. Any effort by a sitting president to abuse power and to erode the independence of independent institutions, to pressure or demean the judiciary, to compromise the autonomy of intelligence agencies, to frustrate the functioning of legal and judicial processes that should be independent, to demonize and victimize his opponents, to concentrate power, to do what Nixon did in trying to get control of the IRS and other administrative agencies for political advantage, to frustrate efforts at transparency. Now, already from what I've said, many of us are very worried. This is the first president in decades who hasn't released his tax returns. It is difficult for many Americans, including myself, to believe that there isn't something in those 30 or 40 years of returns that might be embarrassing, given statements that both of his sons have made inadvertently about the role that Russians have played in their real estate business. One can certainly imagine that there might be damning evidence of financial ties between Trump personally and the Trump businesses and Russian business interests that are, frankly, not very far separated from the Russian government. We can't know that without the returns. But in any case, any intervention that might be appearing to undermine the independence of institutions that need to be independent to sustain a rule of law, or to frustrate independent investigations of his or other questionable activity, would be signs. And so I will just tell you honestly, I shot up like this out of bed in a state of frozen shock when I heard the news that the FBI director had been fired, because it was evident to me instantly why it had happened, that he was increasingly asserting his independence from the White House and his determination to not rest until the concerns about potential evidence of Trump's campaign having contact with the Russian state during the campaign was investigated and settled one way or the other. So this is why many Americans, Norte Americanos, are saying, citizens of the U.S., this smacks of Watergate. There's no possible interpretation for what has just happened other than that it is an effort to frustrate an independent investigation of the president's campaign and potentially the president himself. Now, if that isn't a marker of concern, what is? You asked for an example. I just gave you one. And unfortunately, as of 2 days ago, it's not a theoretical one. Let me now respond to the remaining questions, maybe more succinctly. I've spoken about China and why. So if this continues, I think maybe more and more we might need to say that China is posing an alternative. But I'm not really worried about the China model. I'm just coming from 2 weeks in China. They're deeply worried about their own model. It isn't working so well right now. And I think they face rising problems of governance, corruption control in the absence of judicial independence, and societal demands for greater freedom and openness. Yes, you're right about the disaggregation of the three factors, that what you mainly see and what you see exactly in Latin America is not decline of transparency in the rule of law, but stability. I have not done the analysis that I'm going to suggest to you, but I have a hunch that if one went by country, you'd see that some Latin American countries actually have improved and others have declined. The ones that have improved have consolidated democracy, and the ones that have maybe remained the same or certainly declined have seen democracy decline or become more unstable with it. I think I've spoken about outsiders who try to, maybe I haven't spoken about outsiders who try to topple democracy, because your question was about Erdogan. Part of the problem is that it's hard to know at the outset, when this happens as incrementally as it happened in Turkey, where somebody is headed. And this is why some of us political scientists and analysts in the United States are pursuing this concept and this multi-stakeholder process of a bright line watch. Rather than focus on personalities, rumors, prejudices, it's better to just say, these are principles, these are markers, these are warning signs. If he doesn't cross those lines, we may not like what he's doing on healthcare, we may not like his position on taxes or a lot of other issues, but he's not violating the spirit and principles of democracy. It's just another, and maybe we don't like him personally, but he's not, a harbinger of incipient authoritarianism. But if he violates these lines and principles, and I think every country needs that kind of approach, what do we put in the category of partisan, ideological, and programmatic difference, where we oppose vigorously but accept the legitimacy of the president or prime minister's right to pursue those policies, and we simply try to defeat them? And what do we put in the category of a threat to the institutions and values of democracy? I think we could see developing over the years, maybe not initially, but over the years in Turkey, and we could see now more recently in Hungary, and we can see now in Poland, and we can really see in the case of the Philippines, these bright lines being crossed. And the way the institutions should react is to vigorously call them out. But if the political culture is weak, and the institutions are weak, and the actors in civil society who are calling them out have no basis of solidarity with an identity or class support group for this authoritarian leader, it's hard to mobilize the countervailing forces. And I think this is a very important lesson that emerges from Hungary, from Turkey, and a lot of other cases, and that liberals in the United States need to learn. You can't just appeal to abstract democratic principles. You've got to forge coalitions and listen to the people who voted in a direction you think may have had authoritarian appeals or overtones. This is why I was so impressed with Emmanuel Macron's presidential acceptance speech, and why I want to underscore how different it was from the tone of Hillary Clinton's campaign. And I say this as someone, who respects her and wishes she had been elected and supported her campaign. Clinton called the Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. Macron said on the night of his victory, and now I want to say to those who voted for my opponent, and the people in his rally, I think many of you saw this live like I did, started booing. And he said, no, 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 don't boo them. He said, I want to say to you, I heard you, I respect you, and I want to govern in such a way that 5 years from now, you will not feel the need to vote as you voted for this year. And I think that is the attitude. That's how Democrats, outsiders, insiders, etc., should react to efforts to topple democracy, by trying to build coalitions that enforce democratic institutions. Of course, I agree, sir, with what you said about the importance of civility and civilizational values of respect for the other in an elementary way. And if you lose that, I think democracy is on very thin ground. So this enables me to turn finally to Ms. Cardoso and to say two things. Again, which I hope you will convey my profound respect and admiration for your father. I think his life and his career, particularly as Minister of Finance and as President of this country, shows how important leadership is and can be, and what a difference it can make to the trajectory of a country. When you ask, but we're all asking, what do you invest in to create and maintain a democracy? My answer is, it can't be only one thing. But of course, if you try and do everything at once, then you wind up doing nothing. And so I have a generic answer for you in two parts. One is, the answer, I think, must be specific to every country and the political moment that it is at, because there are urgent priorities in every country. I think in the United States now, we are badly in need of electoral system reform. And that is what I am choosing to invest in beyond the urgent project of this Bright Lines initiative. Our electoral system, nobody is moving toward first past the post in the world. It's a very interesting development. People may move to partially majoritarian systems, but nobody is adopting the British electoral system lock, stock, and barrel. It's very polarizing. It can be very unrepresentative, very distorting of popular will in some respects, very exaggerating of majorities in a way that can embolden leaders with authoritarian tendencies. So I think you've got to, each country at each historical moment, you got to look at the institutions, look at the problems, and pick certain priorities for institutional reform. In the United States, a century ago, our priority was on reining in corruption and the rampaging, greedy activities of monopolistic corporations. And we passed a lot of legislation to regulate the banks, regulate the monopolies, break up the monopolies, and then, of course, extend democracy through direct elections, the voter initiative, and so on. Then, we finally realized that we couldn't be a full democracy if we didn't fully enfranchise our citizens. So the priority was civil rights, the inclusion of African Americans, and then the full inclusion of women into politics as well by moving them into political office. So at different historical moments, I think different priorities present themselves. But the other reason why I'm closing with your question is so I can affirm the educational work that you have made a priority, that Instituto Tuasau has made a priority, and that I think is one important current of the work of this foundation. I just think you've got to keep working as a democracy on culture and values, and you can never take that for granted. And if a democracy takes it for granted, and we are a living instance of it in the United States because we have taken it for granted, civic education has been in a state of profound decline in American public schooling in the United States. I had it, but kids these days don't. And so, they're not girded against all of the assaults that they're experiencing and all of the flows of cynicism they're experiencing in social media. And they're not socialized toward civility and respect for the other and a polite and critically inquiring line of discourse. And they're too inclined to accept fake news, ideology, social bias, and the tribalism that increasingly characterizes our partisan politics in the United States. So I think whatever else the priority is, civic education of young people and socialization to the values and the spirit of democracy always has to be a priority.
Well, that was an inspirational talk. Yeah, that was. I think we really all here are impressed with your knowledge and your candor, which we really welcome very much. And since nobody of us should take democracy for granted, this is an evolving work of art, so to speak. I really would like to make an invitation, a permanent invitation for you to come back, because we really need people like you here in Brazil, who have a global view of the challenges of democracy, but who are at the same time wholeheartedly committed to the values of democracy. So thank you so much for being here. Again, thank you so much, Emil, for your support to this gathering. And thank you all.